Okay, so let's start with a simple picture of mid-ocean ridge mantle upwelling and magmatism. If we accept that this is mostly driven by plate separation, you have passive upwelling of the mantle and decompression melting in this kind of triangular regime, which is pretty clear that not all the melt from the so-called wings gets out. And so we can maybe approximate this thing as a rectangle. And then I just want to make sure you know some rock names. Lertolite, lots of pyroxene. Hartsbergite, less, but quite a lot of orthopyroxene. Still, dunite, of course, is almost 100% olivine. Okay, so taking that rectangle, just a really simple thing going back to Botinga-Naleg. If we can imagine that the melting column is a rectangle, but we have polybaric decompression melting and we're taking the residues out at different pressures, then in this very simple picture, the mean degree of melting is about 50% of the maximum. If we take reasonable values for the so-called dry solidus in the top of the melting column, we get about 6-7 kilometers of crust. So we can't really afford to lose a lot. And it's a very simple picture that we think we understand pretty well and have done for 40 years. For those of you who don't know what a Hartsbergite looks like, here's one in the Josephine peridotite. It's about 20% orthopyroxene. There's some banding or foliation in the olivine parallel to the banding. This is actually a little tiny dunite. Okay, and in many cases, that foliation is parallel to the crust mantle boundary and the paleo seafloor. So it's probably transposed by corner flow at the ridge. Another thing we know quite well is that in olivine-rich rocks, partial melt collects on olivine triple grain boundaries, often idealized with quite a bit of success compared to experimental data, as these triangular or sort of triangular tubules along 3-grain boundaries. Those things often have dimensions on the order of tens of microns or even less. And then the first remarkable observation about mid-ocean ridges that we maybe still haven't really understood is that while the melting region has a width that's on the order of hundreds of kilometers, the crust reaches almost its entire future thickness within a couple kilometers of the ridge axis. This is a remarkable focusing effect from these 10 micron tubules to 100% melt coming out in a region that's just a few kilometers wide. And, okay, I have to teach you some igneous petrology. So the silica content of mantle-derived melts is kind of a barometer. Melts of peridotite at high pressure have low silica contents. Melts of peridotite at low pressure have high silica contents. And mid-ocean ridge basalts record an average pressure of melting of something like 1.5 GPa. So if the melt is flowing in those teeny tiny pores, the equilibration length during the flow path of the melt is much longer than the length scale of the pores. So how do we preserve these high pressures for melts that have migrated through the shallow mantle? If we didn't, then mid-ocean ridge basalts would be andesites, and there wouldn't be any pyroxene in the shallowest residual mantle. If the oceanic crust was andesite, of course, it wouldn't have much of a compositional density contrast with the continental crust, and the planet might look quite different. I am of the opinion that phase diagrams are actually useful in illustrating things. Very many people in this room, but I just can't resist. So here's a phase diagram in terms of olivine, clinopyroxene, and silica projected from spinel or plagioclase, I forget which plagioclase, I guess. And these little golf tees illustrate the place where liquids are co-saturated in olivine, 2 pyroxenes, and an aluminous phase. So again, you see this barometer, these 2.5 GPa melts are very poor in silica, 1 GPa melts quite a bit richer in silica, and the 1 atmosphere melts, which you can't really see under the data here, are much richer in silica. These orange triangles are primitive mid-ocean ridge basalts, and so we can infer that the oceanic crust probably has composition sitting somewhere here. And these are lines of olivine orthopyroxene co-saturation in melts. And so we can see that, again, these things record a mantle melt equilibration pressure of somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5, 1 GPa. By contrast, continental crust would sit somewhere down here on this projection. And so if it were dry, which it isn't, but if mid-ocean ridge basalts were to melt up to about 2 kilobars, then they would have composition sitting over here, very similar to the continental crust, which can be approximated as a melt in equilibrium with the mantle with lots of water at about 1 GPa. So it's a big compositional contrast. And the question is, how do these primitive basalts get through the uppermost mantle to the base of the crust without becoming andesites? All right, so we can go and look at ophiolites, where we have something resembling oceanic crust and shallow mantle thrust up on land, where we can sort of see what's going on. And we can measure the compositions of the minerals in the residual mantle Hartsbergites. In this case, these are clinopyroxene compositions. And these are rare earth elements. These partition very strongly into partial melts. These partition less strongly into partial melts. So there's very, very extreme depletion in the more incompatible elements. We can calculate liquids from the clinopyroxene compositions very readily. Calculated liquids look like this. Almost never see liquids like this on the surface of the planet. The volcanics that form the crust in Oman and mid-ocean ridge basalts have patterns like this. So these residual peridotite are very, very far from equilibrium with the residual peridotite that we sampled near the surface. And that's interpreted very successfully as a result of something like near fractional distillation of partial melts as they form. So the question is now, how do we do this near fractional distillation? What is it that preserves this equilibrium between the shallow mantle and the melts? Forgot to mention a couple slides back, the dissolution rates of orthopyroxene in basalts are tens of centimeters to meters per year. So if you have porous flow and those pores go by orthopyroxene, there's simply no way that that liquid could maintain under saturation orthopyroxene. So you have two choices. You can have fast flow in little cracks or slow flow in big conduits. And so we see a variety of melt transport features in the mantle section of ophiolites. And so here's this transposed foliation that I showed you before. And you can see there's a whole bunch of reasons why these dikes are not appropriate for melt transport beneath mid-ocean ridges, but the most obvious one is that they cut the transposed foliation, so they had to form off-axis. Whereas these red things are dunites, and they are transposed along with the peridotite host rocks, so they have the geometrical characteristics that you would want for melt transport features that form beneath a spreading ridge. Here's a picture of them with a castle for scale. These are Hartsbergites, this brown stuff with banding in it. Then you see these dunites parallel to the banding, getting up to several tens of meters in thickness in this particular outcrop. And when we measure the clinopyroxenes, which are rare, in the dunites, we get compositions that are quite different from the compositions of clinopyroxene in the residual peridotites. When we calculate liquids in equilibrium with those clinopyroxenes, they look a great deal like primitive mid-ocean ridge basalts and the liquids that form the crust in Oman. So they conform to our expectation for conduits that, first of all, carried those liquids to the surface, and secondly, preserved disequilibrium, at least for the rare earths, between the melt in the conduit and the residual peridotites around the conduit. And when we look at them texturally, there's a whole variety of features, but this is the clearest, which show us that these dunites passing through these foliated periddotites are formed by replacement. They're formed by flow of olivine-saturated melt through pyroxene-bearing rocks. The melt dissolves away the pyroxene. Here's a pyroxene-rich band with spinel in it. The little black things are chromium spinels, and you can see the trail of spinels continues across the dunite, so that there's really no way that this is a crack filled with igneous olivine. And there's a whole variety of other features that I don't have time to go into that give us the same kind of result. So, when I was youth, and I was looking at these things, I was very fortunate that Alex McBurney pointed me towards literature in what you might call hydrology, about unstable growth of dissolution channels. So if you have a solubility front, so you have undersaturated solvent flowing into a porous medium that is partially soluble, that planar front is unstable, and it will break down into elongate dissolution channels in the direction of fluid flow, because any perturbation along this front provides, let's say, a higher porosity. Perturbation along that front provides access to more melt or fluid, which dissolves more stuff, which makes the porosity go up. You have a runaway, and these dissolution channels grow exponentially in time. And so this might look familiar to Claude, but we just reproduced your experiments, and we never got any further, so this isn't published. It's a nice picture anyway. So this is a tank with ammonium chloride saturated water in it, cooled from below. And in the ammonium chloride water system, salty, cold ammonium chloride solution is dense, and fresh, warm ammonium chloride solution is buoyant. And so this is cooled from below, so you have descent of warm, salty water in some convection pattern we can't see. Diffusely, that water cools and crystallizes ammonium chloride at the base of the tank, becomes buoyant, and then because diffusion of heat is very fast compared to diffusion of salt and dissolution of salt, we get these dissolution channels where undersaturated water is rising up through that salty pile and making dissolution channels. This is a simpler geometry, now modeled with Lattice-Boltzmann method. And what we've got is a system that's initially saturated everywhere, so we've got little solid particles, these squares, and fluid particles coming in. And initially, the fluid is saturated everywhere in the solid, but there's a gradient in solubility, so that in order to maintain equilibrium with the solid, the fluid has to dissolve solid particles. And so what I like about this is we more or less start from a continuum. There's a square missing somewhere here, I forget exactly where. And over time, you get a dissolution channel that propagates both upstream and downstream, where you've actually now created a very sharp concentration front, because the particles going down the middle of this channel don't see any salt for a long distance. So I like this because it's never been clear to me how those saturation fronts would arise otherwise. Okay, so this is applicable to our melt transport problem because when you melt the mantle, the adiabat for the liquid on its own composition is very different from the adiabat for the partially melting peridotite. The liquid rising on its own composition becomes undersaturated in everything and can even dissolve a little bit of olivine. In the real mantle, it's inconceivable that that would really happen, but so the liquid would run along the olivine saturation surface, but then there's quite a big region where pyroxene is soluble in this olivine saturated melt. And because the heat of fusion for olivine per kilogram is quite a bit larger than the heat of fusion for orthopyroxene per kilogram. At any reasonable condition, constant temperature or enthalpy or entropy, the reaction that dissolves orthopyroxene and precipitates olivine creates additional liquid, less solid. So it creates porosity and acts as a solvent rising through a partially soluble material. And here's a nice experiment done by the group at Brown, where they've taken olivine-saturated basalt and reacted it with a pyroxene-rich peridotite and actually produced not only a dunite zone, but also Artsburgite zone in a Lortz-Light matrix. So the idea is that these dissolution channels form in the mantle about halfway up the melting column. And because they focus most of the flow, once they're there, these are olivine-only dunite conduits, and the most of the melt is traveling up those olivine-only conduits, and that preserves it from reaction with the orthopyroxene-rich surrounding rocks. So enter Einat Aharonov, very smart applied mathematician who fortunately defected into geoscience, and she did a stability analysis of this problem that included compaction as well as the dissolution instability. And she found that the fastest growing wavelength for those dissolution channels is proportional to the melt velocity. And so we imagined that that might give rise to some sort of self-similar behavior because this generation of channels increases the average melt velocity, so that makes the next wavelength grow faster and so on. And we said, we don't really know if this dimension here is space or time, but we like this picture. So we published it. Okay, and then we asked for help from Mark Spiegelman, who had a really nice, still has, a really nice two-phase flow code to model migration of melt in a viscously compacting peridotite matrix. And of course, there's all sorts of important details here, which we don't have time to talk about. But basically, for starters, we had a static box full of peridotite, and we ran melt through it. Again, the melt inside the box initially was all saturated with the peridotite everywhere. But again, there's a concentration gradient such that as the melt migrates up through this box, it has to dissolve pyroxene in order to maintain equilibrium with the solid. And so here's some time series on the top with a absolute porosity scale, and on the bottom where we've normalized the porosity at every height to the average porosity at that height to bring out channel structure that you can't see in this grayscale image here. And what you see is that these are box flushing times that at large times, or well, fairly early actually, there's an emergent set of dissolution channels that coalesces downstream. And if we sample along the top of that box in this kind of system, actually, now we're going to include partial melting, decompression melting. We sample along the top of a model like this, spatially averaging. We can see lots of different peridotites. Okay, the channels record equilibrium with a liquid that is almost exactly like mid-ocean ridge basalt. But most of the volume is occupied by interchannels, and those record these very strongly depleted compositions that we observe in residual peridotites and interpret as the result of some kind of near fractional distillation. And it turns out there's all sorts of beautiful things about this that we can actually have a linear analysis to predict the pattern of coalescence, in which there's lots of channels near the bottom and just a few up at the top. And there's also a temporal evolution where more and more of the flux is concentrated in less and less of the area, or kind of a focusing factor that increases. Okay, so here's Einat's castle, as we call it. Here's the numerical results, dolled up to look pretty. And to a certain extent, there's quite a good correspondence. We see sort of binary coalescence downstream. There's some interesting effects of pressure in here that I want to talk about. But now, okay, so the dimension here is space. And of course, this gives rise to a trivial power law, right? So because the flux doubles every generation here and the number of channels goes down by 2, the flux per channel is inversely related to the frequency of channels of that size. And if we imagine that the flux per channel might be proportional to the width in some way, then we would see a power law in size frequency. Of course, the mantle is surely not a deterministic fractal like that. So here's some dog lungs and some data for actually some very sick people and some healthy people. But your lungs within some restricted dimensional range have power law relationships between frequency and size in both the arterial and pulmonary network. And that's even though they have what people call side branching, so it's not always the case that little conduits join to form bigger ones. You sometimes have very little ones going into gigantic ones. So, of course, we bought a blimp from Adver Blimp in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I still have this blimp if anyone would like to borrow it. The tail fins turned out to be useless. And we had like 5 degrees of freedom on this camera stage, which we quickly wired closed. This is operated by 3 people doing torsion and 1 person positioning the center. It's very labor intensive. The blimp, it's about 8 meters long and 3 meters in diameter, maybe 6 meters long. It can lift about 25, 30 kilos. But my wife wouldn't let me attach my daughter to it. I don't know. So we made these photo mosaics of outcrops in the Cascades just to kind of see what would happen. In this case, black is dunite and gray is Hartsburgite. You can see all sorts of interesting stuff here. But we get this kind of poor man's power law. Okay, this was before we knew how to do this, so this is binned in some weird way. And the slope means nothing. But we get a power law relationship between frequency and width over, 1 order of magnitude or something like that. And so, fortunately, Greg Hirth was involved in this project, and he said, well, let's just, here's the full data set, now binned in a good way, all right? Well, we've actually got cumulative frequency versus width greater than x, or cumulative frequency greater than x. And we sort of pick out the linear part of this relationship. There's obviously huge problems. Actually, it's pretty funny. So we bought every single magic marker in Kelemen, Washington, because we decided we better outline the contacts on the outcrop. There's no time like the present. You could take it back to the lab. But you get into this weird, when you're doing really little dunites, you get into a problem where you suddenly find that instead of outlining the dunites, you're circling the pyroxenes. So there's a philosophical issue with the small end of this. And then there's sampling size issues at the largest. So you just pick out the linear part and extrapolate, and lo and behold, it goes through the frequency of the largest dunites in Oman. So, okay, now we actually ditched the blimp and employed graduate students. But that's me. And somewhere down here is Greg. Yeah, there he is, Greg, 50 meters apart. You see that interesting distribution doesn't look that different. And then the Omanis gave us these air photos, kind of to my amazement. The Sultan's Palace is underneath this magic marker blotch here. But now you can look right in the Sultan's window on Google Earth. But anyway, that area in the previous photos down here. This is the biggest dunite we know for sure in Oman. It's a little bit over 100 meters true thickness. And it goes right across. These are houses right across and into the ocean. So we did a lot of photo interpretation with all sorts of problems. And the embarrassing thing is that this was done with a tape measure on hands and knees, and it's a much better data set than all the other stuff. So, but now, I can think it's safe to say that there really is a power law relationship between number and frequency, size and frequency. With lots and lots of little ones and just a few big ones. So, have we solved any problems with this? Well, not necessarily. I haven't showed you that it is a coalescing network. I just showed you that it could be. But if we say, all right, well, we know in a coalescing network that the frequency of channels is related to their inverse of the flux. We observe in the outcrop that the frequency of given width is related, is a power law relationship with the width. So then we can infer that if it is a coalescing network, the flux is going to be proportional to the width. So the wide ones are going to have more flux per unit width than the narrow ones. Then we can ask the question, is the geometry we observe sufficient to preserve disequilibrium between the migrating melt and the shallow mantle? And the answer is yes, that the flux in the dunites that are much larger than a equilibration length is sufficient to produce all the crust. All right, so we kind of draw this fanciful picture. We think we might have solved this compositional problem. Because we want to, we make them coalesce toward the ridge and solve the coalescence problem, but I want to emphasize that that's made up. Because the coalescence angle in these numerical experiments is very much smaller than the coalescence angle that we need. And I'm not really sure why that is. There's some propositions that there's strongly anisotropic permeability, perhaps related to the formation of shear bands, melt shear bands, in the area of corner flow, or and,
you go on with this, you may have to come back to the slide. Now, why are some of these dissolution channels termination?
Well, because they don't always, especially when their porosity system is well developed, the area between them is nearly impermeable, and the pressure communication between those channels is kind of poor.
Are they able to develop them
because this is, if you like, this is a new one forming. It has undersaturated melt in it, and at the tip there's dissolution going on. So, and another thing, you know, I'm sort of giving stuff away here because I don't think we'll ever do it. But I always thought an interesting JFM paper would be look at the wavelength of the instability with respect to the nature of the solubility gradient, which is certainly not linear in the mantle. So, and again, just to remind you, this is a fanciful picture. This is what we actually see. All right. I'm going to go past this word slide because I want to do something else. So what I've shown you is a lot like erosional fluvial networks. These are rills on a beach. It's sort of trivially similar to the models of coalescing channels. They're all active at once. But there's more here. I don't have time to talk about it, but we know a lot about the dissolution instability. If the flow is very slow, in both this case and the chemical dissolution instability, then you don't get channels. If the flow is very fast, for example, if we made this beach very steep, or we made the concentration gradient very large, then every single pore turns into a channel. And you don't see any emergent behavior either. Now let's look for a minute at the depositional end of this system. So here these rills have deltas. They were formed next to the tide line or a pond. And trivially, they're kind of symmetrical in the sense that flow converges downstream in the erosional region and diverges downstream in the depositional region. And you can see that already here, right? So it's not a big deal. Here's this channel focusing flow, and then you put your thumb over the end of the hose. Of course, the flow has to diverge. This is a model that Anat did, though, and it's a little bit less trivial. So she made dissolution channels in this system, and then she used this as a starting structure. All these are high porosity cylindrical, high porosity conduits. She used that as a starting model, and she said, okay, now there's a gradient in solubility such that the melt has to deposit crystals in order to maintain equilibrium. And what's cool about this is that, so here's the vertical correlation function. And she starts with white noise. Okay, so the probability of a porosity being similar below me or above me is very small. This is the channel structure that is developed in the dissolution model. And this is the porosity structure that results from the crystallization model. So it's kind of reversible, and it returns to a perfectly random network. However, there's time dependence. And this is, if you don't let me even go, I'm going to go a few more slides, but this is important. I'll have to spend some time on it. It's a super simple experiment. Again, we're back with water and ammonium chloride. We had a reservoir above this. This is a vertical section. We had a cold plate with a glass plate on top of it, and a very narrow gap between the two, which you should think of as porosity in the mantle. And so we had room temperature water saturated in ammonium chloride coming in this central hole. And initially, you get crystallization of ammonium chloride all over the place. But very, very quickly, it finds a fast path. And then it acts like a river with levees on the side. When the fluid diverges from that fast path, it slows down, it cools more, and it crystallizes more. And so it armors the wall of the fast path. But it's still crystallizing. And so eventually the fast path is no good anymore. And we were just lucky that our reservoir was high enough above this setup that the walls would frack. And then we'd make a new channel and a new channel, and eventually this fills space. I think that one thing that I would have loved to do and never will, oh shit, come on, is to apply this to some other systems like, for example, black smokers, where a lot like the Jopar and Tate experiments, we have actually a mixed regime where you have cold downflow that's probably precipitating and hot upflow that might be dissolving. And then in general, okay, so this, I would claim that this relationship between these kind of fluvial or aqueous erosion structures and these kind of erosional and depositional features in the chemical system are non-trivially related. So for example, all these dissolution channels are active at one time, but the deltas show time dependence. They do diverge, but at any given time, there's only one or two winners. About 3 more, 5 more. So now I'm going to go out on a limb, if I haven't already, and address the question of whether erosional networks maximize the kinetic energy output over time. And this has been very contentious, and some of my good friends who are far more knowledgeable than I am about physics, like Dan Rothman, thinks this idea is total bullshit, but I don't. So the thing is that I think there's a thermodynamics of erosion here. And of course, we need to understand if we think that's optimal, it's like optimal compared to what? Obviously, we can't take the water on that beach out and then drop it frictionlessly. That energy optimum is not achievable. So the water is going to flow on the surface or through the sand. And then it can form channels, which is clearly better than sheet flow energetically. But the tricky part is how many channels and what would their spacing be. But what I would propose to you is rather than arguing about whether existing river networks do or do not look like static snapshots of networks that minimize dissipation, that we should be looking at time series. And the other thing is that we've gotten a lot, when I first started thinking about this, the phrase optimal network hardly ever appeared in the literature. But there's a bunch of people probably in this room now who are really, really good at figuring out optimal networks under constraints. So my proposition is we should be looking at time series. We will see that the kinetic energy approaches some limit. And then we can ask after the fact, we're now 19th century thermodynamicists, not 20th century statistical mechanicians, ask ourselves what that limit means. And I got Taylor Perrone to do this last night after a year of asking. Exactly a year. So here's the kinetic energy output of one of his landscape evolution models, and you see this very rapid evolution toward increasingly high kinetic energy output over time, and then it approaches a limit which is almost the same for these two catchments. So, thank you very much.